morning, everybody. We are about to get started here with our Facebook Live Q&A for the Language Therapy Insiders Club. So we've had a couple questions come in this week. I think a lot of people have been on break, things like that, and everybody is just getting back into the swing of things. But we have had a lot of questions come in this week about Tier 2 vocabulary and how to use that within some of the frameworks that we talk about in this group. So with that being said, I'm going to get started and go through some of the emails that I've gotten this past week or so. Hey, Michaela, thanks for signing on. And just kind of go through those. So I'm going to start with a question from one of our students, Jessica. And let me see here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read the question out loud and then talk a little bit about how to work through this situation. So the question is, I work in a high school with primarily students with learning disabilities and have been excited to apply what I've learned from Language Therapy Advanced. She started to work on semantic feature analysis and sentence structure and some of those syntax sheets with your students. She started with the word resolution. So again, with a lot of those words, with the ION words, that is a very good suffix to work on because it happens a lot. It can be really confusing with spelling, and it's also one of those key words or it's a key suffix because what it does is that it changes a verb to a noun, or it is one of these suffixes that can be a part of changing a word to from a verb to a noun. So obviously resolution would be something that's derived from the word resolve. So she says she started with that word. It's appropriate for this time of year, was familiar to them. Said I started phonology and spelling, and that really helped those students. So again, she was looking at the different parts of the words, things like that. Felt good to do this type of thing with your students, but unsure what to do next. Let's see. One student expressed how she just wanted to work on reading, although earlier in the year said she wanted to focus on vocabulary, but she's a little bit skeptical. So the question is, where do you go from now? Just some of the tier 2 words might be too easy for the students, and just really needing to, for some of these students, again, with high school students, explain to them why some of this stuff is beneficial. So there are a couple things here. I would, so again, remember when you're doing anything in this program, anything in the Language Therapy Advanced framework, if the student wants to work on vocabulary, really any of these things do target vocabulary. Even if you're working on phonology and morphology, those are going to tie into the student's vocabulary and increase their word knowledge, because part of it is it's going to increase their word recognition in print, and that is going to be something that's going to impact vocabulary. So now, I guess if the student is saying they just want to work on reading, I'm not exactly sure what that means or what that student thinks they mean when they say reading comprehension. So, or if they mean reading comprehension. So really, I would guess, and when a lot of people say, I want to work on reading, especially at the high school level, they're probably going to work on comprehension. I'm not exactly sure because I don't know the situation, but I would guess that a lot of the things that students are required to do in reading at the high school level would involve comprehension. So I would say for this particular student, you want to get a good idea of how well she is able to spell and decode, and how well she is able to just define words in general. If her vocabulary and semantic abilities are, if she does pretty well with some of those things with semantic feature analysis, where you're defining and describing words, what you could do is that continue to cycle through the different approaches in the program. But when you go through semantics and definitions, maybe you just don't spend that much time on it. And maybe you say something like, okay, during reading, part of reading is being able to comprehend and understand and figure out what words mean and be able to think about what those words mean. So when you're doing semantic feature analysis and when you're talking about the different words and when you're defining them and describing them, this is a way that is going to help you remember those words that you're reading, and this is going to help your reading. So the key here is that, again, remember, a lot of the research shows that if students don't have strong background knowledge and strong vocabulary, their comprehension is going to go down. So that's going to be something that you are going to want to be planting in your students' mind. And I would be even aware of the language that you use when you explain this to your students. You might even just kind of plant some suggestions in their mind and say something like, you know what, you are going to find when you are more aware of words and you're more aware of how to study words, that you're actually going to be able to understand more when you're reading. So you're going to be able to understand more. So with this particular student, I would kind of assess how well they do with things like semantic feature analysis and being able to define words. If you feel like they're pretty strong in, or if you feel like maybe the phonology and morphology, maybe her spelling, if that's more of an issue, what you could do is just kind of go through semantic feature analysis, but do it kind of quickly. Something that I even do is maybe for a couple sessions, show them how to do it, show them how to define and describe words, and then I might cycle on to something else, maybe some work on morphology. And I might periodically model a quick semantic feature analysis, and we might do it really quick in like a 2 or 3 minute thing where it's like, okay, let's just write some things down about this word really quickly and define it. And you don't make it an entire session. You just kind of review what you did, and then you get on to your study on morphology. So if the student is doing okay with the semantic feature analysis and definition syntax, or at least kind of gets the gist of it, or you think that maybe that she needs more emphasis on the word decoding, then I would say you could condense that part and then just expand a little bit on the phonology and morphology. So that would mean that you would spend more time, looking at words, looking at word parts, talking about the different morphemes in words, and talking about how to pronounce the different morphemes. That's how you tie in the phonology component. Obviously, with the high schooler, you're probably not going to be doing at and segmenting and things like that. You're probably going to be focusing more on those multi-morphemic words. And then something that you could also do while you're doing that is that you can kind of tie in, again, sort of pull back in and mention that those definition syntax templates again when you are manipulating morphemes. So that's another way that you can explain to her why this is important, because let's say that you take the word resolution and you're like, okay, let's talk about this word, define the word, talk about the different parts of the word. And it's like, okay, let's, maybe describe it really quickly and define it. But now let's change it. Let's take the morpheme off the end. Let's change the word to resolve. Now let's go back and define it again. And maybe you could even do a quick semantic feature analysis. And for some of these, if you're just reviewing, you might even model part of it for them and kind of go back and forth between having them do it and you do it if you want to just do it really quickly within a morpheme study. But what you could do is when you change the meaning of the words, because you're manipulating the morphemes, what you could do is then be like, okay, we've changed the meaning. Let's talk about what the word means now. And now it's a verb. You've got to use a different syntax template to explain what that word means. So that's how you could do this if you wanted to make it a little bit more focused on the reading and decoding. And if the student is saying things, and again, and I totally get this, because I know that even some teachers will say this, and it totally depends where the student is. There are a lot of students in high school that really don't need to be doing explicit work on on phonology and morphology, because maybe they just are meta enough, they're cued into that, their spelling and decoding skills are strong. And so maybe they need to be focused more on those high level comprehension, executive functioning, problem solving type things. And yes, she is probably going to have to do that a lot of the time, especially if she is working with a resource teacher. The resource teacher is probably working on those types of things with her. So that could be something where you might explain, it's like, okay, how well are you able to comprehend if you're spending so much energy trying to figure out what words mean, if you can't decode a word, if you don't know how to read it, those kinds of things. So I would be continually saying, like, you know what, you're going to find that as you are more aware of how to pronounce words and able to recognize words quickly, you're going to be able to read better. So, and if she, you could even kind of explain to them, like, hey, you've been working on this reading comprehension for a long time, and it's still something you're working on. So maybe we need to hit it at a different angle in here. So I might even recommend, especially if you know that she's working on some of those reading comprehension skills, like high level comprehension skills, and with other practitioners, maybe at home, maybe in the general education classroom, maybe with the LD teacher, say like, hey, let's do this from a different angle over here. And this is going to be the missing puzzle piece. And just continue to show her the connection there. And, maybe you might even, if you have an example of a text that's really hard, and that has words that that she can't read, or that maybe you can't even read, you can read it together, and it's like, okay, how much do we really remember from that, because we didn't know any other words and we couldn't read any of them, kind of thing. So you can show her some examples of that too if you really have a hard time getting buy-in. But I would just use those subtle suggestions throughout, like, hey, you'll find that once that you improve this over here is going to increase as well. And that being said, depending on how she's doing with this morphology study, there are times that it could be appropriate for her to, for you to try some of those reading comprehension strategies, like stating the main idea, answering detailed questions, and things like that. Yeah, you could absolutely pull some of those things into your therapy sessions and have that be the main focus of some of your sessions. And then maybe you're kind of pulling in, again, some of those more structured things you're doing, like syntax study, defining the words. Maybe periodically while you're reading those passages, you talk about specific words and you like point out the different parts of the words, like the morphemes or the meanings and things like that, and pull it in that way where it's not the main focus of your session. If you do know that she's getting that elsewhere and that she needs work on the other more structured stuff, I wouldn't do that the entire time, but it's certainly okay to kind of cycle through and have that be a stage in your therapy where you're kind of doing semantics and definitions, and then you have some work on syntax, then you've got some work on the morphology, orthography, phonology, and then, maybe you cycle in some of that high level work on narratives and reading comprehension as another phase that you're cycling through. And all the while you're doing that, while you're kind of shifting your focus, you're always looking for opportunities to pull in some of those other things that you're working on. So even how I would sometimes do it is, if I was working on complex sentences with my students and I knew they were having a hard time comprehending them, I would look for opportunities within that passage to ask them a question that would require them to go back into the passage and look at a sentence that had multiple clauses. Or, let's say that we worked on a certain prefix or suffix or just multimorphemic words in general. I would go back and look for opportunities to ask them to infer meanings of those words, explain and define those words, or just generally ask them questions that had to do with those specific vocabulary. So part of Jessica's question is, where do I go now? What words do I use? And should I use things like ReadWorks? she said something, let's say, that the passages for grades 9 to 12 may not be engaging and interesting enough to keep them motivated. I'd give them a go. I mean, honestly, it is hard to get passages that are engaging and interesting and also challenging enough. So I would start there with ReadWorks and do your best. You know, like you can give students, when I was working with high school students, I would use ReadWorks passages and I would give the student choice of topic or genre, or I would pick the genre and then be like, okay, here are the options, and then allow them to pick. The thing is that level of interest is huge with reading comprehension, but I think it's a valuable lesson to learn, like sometimes you don't just get to do stuff that you're interested in. Like sometimes it's good to venture out because maybe you could get interested in other things. Like how many times have you tried something new that you didn't think you were going to like and you liked it? That might depend on your personality and how adventurous you are. But I would just, and then there's this also the lesson of like, sometimes you just like, there are times in life when you do things, you do specific skills and tasks that might not always seem fun and engaging, and you do it for the sake of like the greater good in your own life, for the sake of being committed to something, because you know that further down the line it is going to benefit you. So it's kind of like, you know, sacrificing what you want to do right now for what you really want in the long term. Well, do you want to be able to be a reader and have an education and be able to understand what you're reading for a variety of different passages so that when you're older, you can read for pleasure, so that you can go to college and be able to learn all of those things? Well, if that's the case, then right now you might have to read a passage that's a little bit harder and might not be as interesting for the sake of, you know, challenging yourself and learning some more difficult vocabulary. It's kind of like, you know, I woke up this morning and it was kind of cold out and I maybe didn't feel like going outside and going for a run and working out, but I did anyways. And then I felt better once I was doing it. And I do that for the sake of all the other activities that I like to do that require me to be in good physical shape, things that I enjoy. So those kinds of things. So I do agree that yes, if you're making a student read super boring passages all day, every day, then they're not going to like it. They're not going to be engaged. And if they don't see how that's going to benefit them, then yeah, you're not going to have good motivation. But I think that there is a high sense of entitlement. And I think that there does need to be some reinforcement of commitment and responsibility to developing your own skills. So that's what I would say about, you know, it kind of went on a sidebar and a soapbox about being interesting and engaging, but I would definitely like start there, start with those ReadWorks passages. They have good vocabulary in them and they've got questions in them already. You can create a student account. You can log in and do it for free. Start there, make it easy for yourself. And then, yeah, like if you want to have your students bring in some books that they're reading that they really like, and maybe that can be something that you work on as well, that would be something else that you could do for kind of a reinforcement. So vary it up. You know, obviously giving students some autonomy with that is going to help. And as far as what words to choose, you're right. The tier 2 question words in language therapy advanced might be too easy for your students. I would introduce them, and if the students are kind of like rolling their eyes, like this is so easy, just be like, this is just to see where you are, and this is just to explain the activity to you. I know that you might know these words, but you know what? Like you could even explain to them, like sometimes when I go back and do some of these activities that I did in elementary school, I've forgotten how to do them, or I remember things that I didn't, you know, that I kind of forgot. So we're learning the process here, and we're going to make this more difficult over time. But I wouldn't assume, because a lot of times kids with language disorders, they have holes, they're missing pieces that you think they would know. They might know this thing over here that's really hard, and then they might have some of these other syntactic structures that they don't know, that they've just been kind of getting by without knowing. So I wouldn't assume that they know those words. The tier 2 question words are good to have handy if you find that when you're asking them questions, they are not exactly answering the question that you asked them. Don't assume that your students will know how to do that, because I have been in conversations with adults, like adults that don't have any disabilities, and they don't answer the question that you ask them. And it's like, wait a minute. And part of it is just like paying attention and things like that. But it's kind of good to go back and be like, wait a minute, you didn't answer the question here. It's kind of like watching a political debate on TV, like when somebody from the audience answers a question and you listen to all of the candidates' responses and you're like, nobody answered the question. So adults did it. So adults do it. Intelligent adults do it. So this is a good skill to teach your students, even though it seems kind of, I don't know, easy, silly, whatever. The other question in here was, where do I find tier 2 words for my students? So there are a number of different places. Obviously, people in the Vocabulary Foundation, I do give you a list of tier 2 words that goes from kindergarten through 8th grade. So with that, it doesn't mean like these are the only words that you can work on in kindergarten. It doesn't mean these are the words that kids have to know in kindergarten. It just means these are the words that kids are being exposed to across all of these grade levels based on the curricular materials at the time. So what it is some samples for you that give you an idea of examples of tier 2 words and give you some words that you can use for probes to start with. It doesn't mean that you couldn't use one of those 8th grade words with a high schooler, because a lot of times, like I remember my coworker's daughter, there was a word that the word blustery was in the kindergarten tier 2 words. And my coworker said something like, texted her daughter and was like, is it a cold blustery day over there? And she was like, what the heck does blustery mean? And so it was a kindergarten word. This college educated, really intelligent person didn't know what that word meant. So again, there are always holes. It just means that this is what kids are being exposed to. And so they're likely to know it. It's likely to be appropriate if you know that they're being exposed to those words, because vocabulary growth, and as far as what's age appropriate, is so highly dependent on environment and what they're exposed to, especially when you think about reading passages. So with that being said, if you are in the Vocabulary Foundation, you can use some of those words. Again, even the junior high words, even you don't have to just use those words for those grade levels, but it's kind of a starting point for you. But if you're working with high school students, I would recommend what you can do is maybe talk to the math teachers, the language arts teachers, even social studies and science teachers, and get an idea of the vocabulary that they're learning. I'd say if I had to pick one, I would say language arts, because those are the words that tend to be tier 2 words. When you get to the content areas, a lot of times they're more tier 3. But the reason that I say to talk to them, and this is especially something that comes up a lot in math, is that sometimes there are words on assessments that aren't necessarily unit specific that kids need to know across different units. And it might not be something that is like, this is, for example, like this is the one concept we're working on in this unit or whatever, but there might be certain words that students are always expected to know across the different tests. So by simply looking at the different tests, you might be able to get some ideas about words that happen often. Same with social studies and science. They might be asked to summarize or describe or debate, or some of those words, not necessarily the words that go with the specific units, but I would look more for those words that, like if you looked at a couple of their assessments that come up often, and then also one place that's a little bit more efficient would be language arts, because again, those words tend to be words that are a little bit more, that are a bit broader as far as words that are common across the curriculum and that are going to be common when it comes to reading different texts and reading literature. And then you can also just, if you have, it's great if you have access to some of their textbooks. If you could get copies, that's awesome. Sometimes they have extra teachers' manuals floating around, or at least worksheets or copies of something. If you can just take a look at those, those are places you can get vocabulary as well. But then also, like, you can prepare as much ahead of time, but if you're in a session, don't be afraid to pick a word on the fly. For example, in those read works passages, there are vocabulary words picked out, and a lot of times the questions that they ask in those passages are about those vocabulary words. And then another thing is that, so there are certain words that are like the key focus words of the passage in read works, but then you can also just look in the passage, and if you're kind of like, oh, hey, I noticed this is a hard word, like you can pick out other words as you're reading. Especially be aware of words that might have certain patterns or might be related to words that you're already working on. So for example, if you worked on the word resolution, and maybe you talked about the ION suffix, maybe you look for some other words in that passage that have that suffix. So just get used to kind of being aware of those things, because you can pull some of those things on the fly. And that would be a way that you can kind of pick those words and focus those students. All right, so there's always so much to talk about when it comes to how to put this framework together, how to work with different grade levels. So I know I went really in depth in that question. There was another question about high school and tier 2 words. Okay, so this question comes from Tim. She says, I work with high school students with language disorders. Many have a wide gap between typical language and their ability. Expectations for most of them is to perform typical high school academic endeavors. Should I choose tier 2 words just above their ability level to kind of catch them up, or do I choose high school tier 2 words? The high school words seem to be so far beyond where they're at. So this is essentially, I would say almost the opposite question, because it sounds like with Jessica's question, they were closer to grade level, but with Kim's situation, they are a lot further behind. So I wanted to explain a little bit about, especially when people are saying, like, I have to be Common Core aligned, they need to have access to the curriculum, I need to be aligning with grade level standards. So there's a little bit of a confusion, and I think even among school administrators, about interpreting what that actually means. So you might have the goal to get them to grade level, but if they are like, they're here, the goal is here, like high school words or standards are here, and they're down here, and you are working on the next difficult skill, and you're working like the students here, and you're kind of pulling them up to the next level above where they're at, to get them closer to here in sequence. So kind of pulling them closer to up here, then technically, yes, you are aligning, because you're doing those prerequisite skills that are going to get them to where they need to be grade level. Now, yes, if they're already in high school, are they going to completely catch up? Maybe not, but we get them as far as we possibly can. I mean, you can function. I mean, newspapers are like a 5th grade reading level. A lot of adults don't read beyond a 9th grade reading level just in their day-to-day lives. So you get them as far as you can. And you know, maybe they learn, they have a job where they're not required to do a lot of reading. Like I have a student who, his dad has a learning disability as well. And this student, there's a lot of, you know, behavior, attitude types of things, partly from frustration, but partly just because, you know, he doesn't have the greatest work ethic with school. But his dad is a carpenter and has a really successful business. And so the student wants to do what his dad does. He likes to do it. It requires some reading and some writing. Sometimes he has to use written communication, especially online with emails and things like that. You know, you're going to have to do some written communication more than what we used to have to do like 20 years ago. But having said that, he probably could grow up to be pretty successful without ever reaching that high school level, reading level. So that, just wanted to put that out there, because I know a lot of times we worry about, like students have to be meeting these standards. It's like, well, what do they want to do with their lives after this? Maybe they don't. Maybe we just get them as far as they can, because obviously being a good reader, it just opens a lot of doors, especially because there's a lot of information online. There's a lot of ways you can teach yourself information through reading. It's not the only way, but it is one way that's widely accessible to people. So it is a huge advantage to be able to learn things through reading and to be able to communicate through reading and writing. So now that I've gone off on that soapbox, let's go back. And again, yes, to your question, yeah, you can certainly pick tier 2 words that are a little bit more difficult than where they are. I would say, and again, like, it's so hard to be like, they're at this level and like this is the tier 2 word list that's age appropriate for them. So you always, regardless of the level, probably need to play around with it. I would say if you think they're a little bit lower, you might try tier 2 words from 8th grade. And if those seem too difficult, you might go back, a couple grade levels. Again, a lot of times those words just mean this is what students are being exposed to. It doesn't mean that they have to know them, because a lot of times you're exposed to something and you don't fully know it yet. So it might be normal for even a regular grade level student to not know all of the tier 2 words that are presented in high school. So yeah, I would say go back, see what they can do. Remember that a lot of times when you're doing word study and things like that a a lot of times you're focused more on the process rather than the content. We absolutely want to be mindful of picking the right words and picking high quality words, because teaching words directly is something we know works. But at the same time, we don't want to feel like, oh my gosh, I have to get through this word list and I have to stress about the words that I'm using, because there really is no magic system or magic, there's not like a magic word list out there that's like, this is what they need to know and this is the perfect word list for this grade. So I would say focus on the process. Sometimes you might even have to go even easier when you're teaching them a new skill. So for example, the first time we teach definition syntax, the first time you do morpheme study, the first time you do semantic feature analysis, all of those things, you're going to be doing words that are going to be easier, and then you're going to gradually work up to harder words. So whenever you're focusing on learning a concept the first time, you're going to start with the easier words and then start pulling in those more difficult words and just see how far you can push them. But I think if anybody were to, and I know sometimes people are like, my administrator wants me to do it this way, or my administrator wants me to show that they know these words or whatever. Like they know they've met the standard by knowing this word list. And honestly, that's why I don't recommend writing goals for will know these number of words. I recommend writing the goal for being able to perform the strategy. Sometimes you could say something like will define grade level words with, with appropriate definition syntax. And so, yes, you've added the grade level words statement in there, but what you're really more focused on is that they can actually do the process of defining the words appropriately. So you're focused more on that. That's how you measure the growth, rather than like they know these words and they can do it with these words, because ultimately what's going to help them over time is that they're going to have, you want to give them the structure and the process for being aware of those words, being able to explain those words, because that's what's going to help them learn more words. So yeah, I would focus on the processes more than the words. But again, don't like, it's not a, you're doing your students a disservice by if you're kind of like, if you're pigeonholing yourself into having to know specific word lists, because again, once once that word list is done, it's like, how is that really helping them? You want to teach them to learn, not just, teach them a specific set of words. So that's how I would recommend handling that. So I think, again, most of the questions that came in today were relating to high school tier 2. So that's how I would handle that. I don't see any other questions that have come up through my email. I'm going to scroll through the Facebook group really quickly to make sure. I know that a lot of times what I'll do is I will answer questions that have come up in the community since the past Q&A. But let me see here. There was one other question. Okay, one other question that came in a couple weeks ago from Elizabeth. She says, a student of mine has an open book test in language arts today. We reviewed the material yesterday. In one of the exercises, she had to write a Diamante poem. Let's just say that writing poetry is challenging for students who are still working on parts of speech. While I don't feel that writing poetry is her most immediate need, I want to figure out how to support her. So again, this does happen a lot where the task that they're working on for their test is like, seems like it's this huge be all end all, like, oh my gosh, we've got to be able to do this for the test. And then it takes you away from what you're actually working on that's actually going to benefit your student. Not that I don't have an appreciation for poetry. So what I said is that, again, do what's best, like do your best with it, do your best to teach formatting. I think that with poetry, there are unique syntactic structures and unique vocabulary. There's a lot of metaphors and figurative language. So that does give you some opportunities to be very meta with your students. So that can be very beneficial. So there are some benefits, especially if you're working on syntax and things like that. And they are also working on poetry in their language arts, that's an opportunity to pull it in. But I would say, the biggest thing that you want to do is just use it as a tool for something that you are working on. So a lot of times, in the past, teachers would say something like, hey, can you help them with this worksheet? Or, this is something that we're working on. Is there something that you can do here? And so I think setting boundaries is really important there, because a lot of times, like if a teacher is literally just giving you an assignment and says like, go work on this with a student, or can you work on this with a student, or whatever. If you're just working on their homework with them, then you're kind of just a glorified tutor. And that's not what you want to do. What you want to do is when you have those assignments, that's a great opportunity, especially if a teacher is reaching out to you and sees you as a person who can help. But what you want to do is just kind of like look at it, see what concepts are in that assignment that you're already working on, and just kind of pull it in to whatever you were going to work on in a therapy session. Like it wouldn't make sense if a teacher's already got their lesson plans for you to go in and be like, work on this worksheet with them during class. Yes, I know it's a smaller group with us, so it's a little bit easier for us, but again, that could be something where like for poetry, things like that, you could maybe look at the poems and see what different word types are used, see what different syntactic structures she could be working on in there, that different types of sentences that come up in there. Point out that sometimes in poetry, we speak in incomplete sentences and things like that. Sometimes we use metaphors. And so you could define some of those words in there. And all of those things, just that awareness is over time going to make her more aware of how to do better poetry. But if you're just kind of like teaching to the test and teaching this one little thing as a discrete skill so that she can spit it out on the test, it's not going to benefit her in the long run. And so the other thing that I said is like, okay, let's say that you do that, and because like you do what I said and kind of pull things out, but don't necessarily teach that specific format exactly how it needs to be done for the test. Like you've done something, you've kind of made a temporary sacrifice for a long-term gain. like temporarily, some of those things that you did with her might not sink in time for the test. So you might not see the fruits of your effort yet, but if you do those things over time, it is going to benefit the student in the long run. And that's what we want to do here. We want to be thinking about the long-term game, not like, you know, did she get an A or a B or whatever she wanted to get on that test. So the downside is that she might not have done well on that test. But the question is does it really matter? We decided that it matters, but a lot of times it's like, is it really the end of the world if she didn't get the exact grade that she wants on that test? Maybe not. So that's something to think about as well. I think that a lot of times we're told certain things are important and things are kind of like, oh my gosh, this is, you know, the hugest deal in the world. And it's like, maybe it is because you've decided it is, but it really doesn't have to be. So I challenge you to think about those types of things when they come up, especially when, and this seems to be kind of high school edition today, but that does happen a lot of times that in high school or secondary school, well, really at any grade level, but it happens probably more in high school just because of the different types of things that they have to do in high school, where it's like, well, is this really going to benefit you in the long run? Well, the result of the test might not. But some of those other opportunities that I mentioned might in the long run if you use them the right way. Yes, obviously, a lot of the things that we do with literature and language arts, they're a huge opportunity to enrich our vocabulary, enrich our awareness of different sentence structures and things like that, or just enjoyment and appreciation for it. So obviously there are some benefits to it, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and worry about things that don't matter that much. So, and take us away from things that might not be the main priority, because what happens is, like, a lot of times you might say, okay, maybe this one day I can just work on this thing with her. But then you have to think about, all right, how much time do I really have with my students? Do I really want to sacrifice that time? Is it really worthwhile? And I think sometimes we underestimate how often we say yes to things and don't set those boundaries just for the sake of, like, you know, whatever that immediate thing is there. And then it kind of adds up over time. So we've got to be aware of those things just because we want to make sure that we're doing what's best for our students. So that's what I would say in that particular situation. So let me see if there's anything else that has come up. I've reposted a lot of the different Q&As, so they're coming up a lot on my newsfeed. Couple other things here, actually. Let me address. Okay, here we go. All right, let's go to this one. This question by Allie. Should we specifically target parts of speech? She says she's been starting with semantic feature analysis, but wondering if they first need to know what nouns, verbs, and adjectives are so they can determine what ways, like what semantic features they need to discuss. Because yes, like, you're going to describe a noun different from a verb, and then when you define a noun versus a verb, the sentence structure is going to be different. So I know that in English and language arts, sometimes they will do like noun sorting and like sort all the verbs and sort all the nouns. I don't recommend spending a ton of time on that, and it's certainly not a prerequisite skill. Language isn't like that. There's not always a clean hierarchy of skills when we get really past those early developmental milestones, especially with some of these higher level things. So, I mean, even think a lot of times, I guarantee you that if you gave a group of adults that haven't had language arts instruction for many years and maybe don't read a lot, maybe don't have a job where they have to be thinking about words a lot, I guarantee you that a lot of them probably would miscategorize words just because of, like, lack of awareness, not paying attention. It doesn't mean that they're not using those words right. We do have to be a little bit more explicit with our students. Some of the things that we get direct with them, like that we might teach them explicitly, we don't think about explicitly because we implicitly know how to use them. We have to be more direct with our students because they're not implicitly figuring out how to use them. So we need to bring those things to their awareness. But with parts of speech, this is something that there isn't a huge return on the investment of your time if you're doing a lot of those rote drill activities. So what I recommend doing is just talking about nouns and verbs in the context of semantic feature analysis and embedding it within other instruction. There's a lot of opportunities within the LTA framework to embed that instruction. So when you're doing semantic features, it's like, okay, is this word a noun or a verb? Oh, it's a person, place, or thing. Okay, so we're going to talk about like categorization and its function and things like that. So you can embed it there. You can embed it when you define the word because it's relevant there. You can talk about it when you're studying the morphemes because the morphemes are actually going to change the class of the word. Or even if you have some of those grammatical morphemes, well, you're adding grammatical morphemes to a word, that could mean it's a verb. You're adding a plural, that means it's a noun. So there's all types of different ways you can embed it and talk about it and actually do it in a more functional, contextualized way. So I recommend doing it that way. That being said, if you are going to do a little bit of it, I recommend it as kind of a priming exercise. And I say this for kids who maybe have a hard time with categorization because there's so many like categorization worksheets and things like that. With skills like that, when I say a priming exercise, it's one of those things where you're going to just do a quick exercise, just a couple minutes before you do the actual functional exercise. It's kind of like how, let me think of an example here. Okay, so like before you, like when you watch an athlete do some type of sporting event, I'll use figure skating because I was a figure skater. Like if you ever watch figure skating on TV and you see them, the person who's about to go out and skate, sometimes they'll be kind of like doing mini jumps or they'll be doing the motions of the jumps without actually jumping and just sort of like, again, priming themselves, or they'll be kind of doing little positions without actually doing their entire routine just because they want to, again, like remember those motor and like give themselves a cue to remember the activity that they're about to do to kind of warm themselves up. So the thing is if they just did those things right there and then never actually did their routines, they'd never get better. But it's one of those things that they can do to kind of get themselves amped up and ready to go. So if you are going to do some of those decontextualized things like sorting nouns and verbs, I would do it as kind of a quick, like, all right, we're going to study some words. Let's look at these words we're going to study today, and let's talk about, like, let's put the nouns over here and let's put the verbs over here. Or I'll use categorization as an example because that comes up a lot. People a lot of times are like, they can't understand the categories, or shouldn't I figure out if they can understand these words in a hierarchy first before you do semantic feature analysis? No, you don't need to do that. But again, what you can do is kind of prime, where it's like, all right, let's name some things that go with this word before we start describing it, or let's take some of these words and name their categories really quickly before we start describing some of these other words, just as like a quick little warm-up thing, and then do the actual activity. So use them as priming activities, not the activities themselves. When you just stop there with that activity, or where you're like, where you use it as like they have to know these skills before you actually do the functional thing, a lot of times you don't ever actually get there because the way to actually teach them to apply the skill is to actually do the more challenging activity itself. So that's how I'd recommend those types of things. Again, embedded instruction, just embed it in there. Okay, last question from Jessica. When you're suggesting the goal of defining and describing words with semantic features, are you thinking 3 to 4 different types of semantic features or 3 to 4 total attributes? Okay, so what she's asking is, so let's say that you have a goal and you want a student to be able to name 3 to 4 things about a word when you're doing semantic feature analysis, because it's not necessarily functional or realistic to be able to get kids to rattle off a perfect semantic feature analysis. When they're describing a word, we go through all of those things with them to give them that facilitation, give them that exposure. But when we're just like, okay, describe this word, tell me about this word, you don't necessarily expect them to do all of them perfectly, because some of them might not even be relevant for certain words. They might not be key defining features. So what she's asking is, when you want a kid to say 3 to 4 things, does that mean like if they say 3 functions of a word, have they done it right? Or do you want them to say 3 different things? So like the category, the association, the function, the location. I would say there's not really a right answer to that. It's almost like remember the type token ratio that you may have learned to do in grad school, where it's like you looked at the number of different words that a student did, and you also looked at the number of different words a student did. So you looked at just strict quantity, and then you also looked at diversity. I tend to err on the side of wanting it to be more diverse. If you have a kid that literally can't say anything about a word, then yes, it is an improvement if you can get them to say 3 to 4 things, even if they're the same type of feature. I would err on the side of diversity, because what kids kind of do, especially kids with language disorders, is that they'll kind of like find one pattern that they know and latch onto it and have like a death grip on it. And we want to get students out of that. We want them to understand that there's more flexibility with language. So I would tend to err on the side of doing different attributes. That being said, that's not a set in stone only way to do it. It depends on if you want to simply expand the amount of what they're saying, or to be more diverse in the type of information that they are giving. If you've got a kid where it's like, tell me about this word, and they're like, it can be red, it can be blue, it can be green, like it's like, I think it was crayons. And I remember I asked a kid to tell me about it. They're like, they're red, they're blue, they're green, they're yellow, they're brown. They're like, and they just kept going on with different colors, and they just got stuck. So if you've got a kid that's getting stuck, then you definitely want to err on the side of diversity. But if you have, again, if you think it's beneficial to get kids to say just more, if they're really a kid that doesn't say anything, then you could accept the different, just strict quantity. So that's how I would handle that. All right. Well, we are right about at the hour. If nobody, again, I always like to go back and have people submit questions, because I know a lot of people during the day we're in therapy sessions. People are running around after work and things like that. So that's why there's always a recording that you can watch later. So that's why a lot of times people like to submit questions beforehand and then watch later. But I can always answer questions live on these sessions as well. I know there's a little bit of a delay in me talking and you listening, so I'm going to wait just a second. But if there aren't any other questions, I will go ahead and wrap this up and log off. As usual, if you ever have a question about anything course content related, just go ahead and post it in the Facebook group. That is always the best place to get answers about clinical questions. If I know sometimes before a live Q&A, I will send an email out and say, hey, what are your questions? Hit reply. Then obviously you can reply to that email. But in between calls, you're always going to get a quicker answer about therapy technique. And it is going to be more beneficial for the group so other people can see it if you post it in the Facebook group. So that's how we will handle that. All right. If there aren't any other questions, I'll go ahead and sign off. And everybody have a wonderful day.